Thank you so much, Jason. I appreciate this opportunity to discuss testing committees today. The goal here is to really review the role that a testing committee can play in moving your program forward. Obviously, with my background in nursing education, most of the examples I'll be giving relate to a school of nursing, but the testing committee can most definitely make an impact across all different types of disciplines in higher education. Why would a testing committee be necessary, and why are we starting to see a trend develop where testing committees are now being formed? Well, I think it's clearly an indication of the demand for measurable achievement of program outcomes that has occurred in higher education. No longer is the process of higher education the key portion for evaluation, but now program outcomes have come under increased scrutiny. So faculty need tools that allow them to survey for gaps in their curriculum, to look at the outcomes of academically at-risk students and how those students are being handled throughout the curriculum. So as a result, there's much more systematic interest and need for consistency in the way that testing as the evaluation, the primary evaluation mechanism used in higher education, is actually implemented across the curriculum. And truth be told, we have more faculty retirements with folks that have a lot of experience in curriculum evaluation, and they're being replaced by faculty who, as the example of nursing, are highly skilled, particularly with their clinical backgrounds, but may not have a lot of experience in the academic setting. So curriculum evaluation becomes a lower priority as there's a need to just manage day-to-day priorities among the more inexperienced faculty that are now really implementing the program. But as reaffirmation of accreditation comes up, then there's a scramble in a lot of instances to try to figure out where the paper trails are and how the evaluation's been conducted throughout a period of years. So one of the things testing committees can do is to bring these issues up as a continual point of evaluation so that you can avoid the scramble right before accreditation. You can also improve skills intentionally among inexperienced faculty in areas such as item writing and conducting a systematic exam analysis after every test through the activities of a testing committee. And from the administration's point of view, I would say that some of the experience that administrators have had in the past is that testing policies have lacked consistency, and this has created problems when policies are enacted that affect student graduation, student progression, very important milestones in the student's education, and conflict ensues. So one of the things that will be typical now across all of higher education is their program outcome focus becomes the key. Policymaking will have to have an evidence basis to support it, and there'll have to be consistency that's demonstrated in how these policies are applied. So testing policies and procedures, being both evidence-based and consistent, are going to become key for programs if they've not already identified in that way. So you've got to have very well-written testing policies and procedures that are consistently carried out. And your testing committee can assist by improving the defensibility of tests used in the curriculum. If they're able to require the production, for instance, of a standard test blueprint that can be easily pulled as documentation of the instrument being relevant to course objectives and testing along the course topical outline that was presented, that's a strong point within the curriculum. And the fact that standard scoring procedures are used will help, particularly in those instances when perhaps a student has grieved scoring situation and the faculty need to clearly show that there was not any type of capricious activity surrounding grading. So the recommendation about testing policies and procedures, obviously these are constructed around the American Psychological Association Code for Fair Testing Practices. In education, I'm given a link to that, but they can easily be obtained online. Statistical analysis information that is statistically calculated and applied routinely to every test situation should be accrued in a manner that allows faculty easy access to it so they can pull this out if they do need to document the fact that they've conducted a test analysis following every test. And there should be some consistency in the types of procedures that are used so that, again, every student receives fair treatment in every course every time. The computerized reports that are available through testing software applications really assist in streamlining this effort for the faculty, and they can prove to be invaluable in a situation such as preparing for reaffirmation of accreditation or dealing with a difficult student situation in a student affairs type of committee. Excuse me. So there really needs to be some synergy with the testing policy and the way that the policy is implemented across the curriculum. Primarily, this means that there needs to be some relationship between the way the testing policies have been constructed and the way they're carried out, and how they relate to admission, progression, and graduation policies, which those in most institutions are clearly the domain of the Student Affairs Committee, while the testing group tends to be more of a subset of an overall curriculum committee or the faculty council. So I would recommend as programs are setting up testing committees, they need to be aware of the fact that there should indeed be very, very clear and open communication among these committees and how they operate, and there should be clear alignment so that the testing committee wouldn't be making recommendations that would somehow be in conflict with policies that were really within the oversight of student affairs or which had been acted upon by the full faculty. So a good rule of thumb is whenever policies and procedures are being created that impact things like grading, student grievance, admission requirements, student success, in other words, if they've had academic failure, if they've had a withdrawal from a course, they're seeking readmission to a program, progression, or graduation, then there's got to be some look at how the testing policies that may be recommended by the testing committee actually interface across the Student Affairs Committee domains. Testing committees typically do not formulate policy independently, but they make recommendations to the larger committee, the Faculty Council, as I mentioned, or a full curriculum committee, and that should be the same role that the Student Affairs Committee tends to take so that there is synergy across all of these policies. One of the real helpful pieces of information that can be accrued primarily longitudinally, but we also even look at this cross-sectionally, is a way of taking aggregated student test data and applying that information across what we know currently about our curriculum. So if you have student response data that you've been accruing, you've got to be able to grasp that, boil it down so that you can really analyze it. And one of the ways I recommend doing that is through a testing software application. You can track the cohort's performance against established benchmarks, which your testing committee would have recommended to the curriculum committee or the faculty council to adopt as policy. And those can be compared to previous cohorts, and that's very, very helpful, particularly as a new curriculum has been established and you're looking for gaps. You can use your data to compare groups, students that were in the previous curriculum versus the new curriculum, to be sure that there's a consistent experience, and improvements that were expected should be noted and they can be documented in this way. You can also look at multiple cohorts to look at weaknesses that might be occurring consistently, maybe in a single course, or maybe if you're teaching in a concept-based curriculum, if there's a weakness that keeps recurring, perhaps you're seeing it on a standardized test, you can go back then to your teacher-made test data and you can look and see if that weakness is also showing up in teacher-made test results. So these can be extremely valuable for curriculum evaluation, and faculty will feel less that they're making all their decisions on simply subjective data and opinion about concepts that may need to be strengthened in a curriculum, and are making much more evidence-based decision-making in regard when they use the student test results and the item analysis statistics to make these revisions. You can save yourself a large amount of time by being able to grab that data, as I said, out of a software program, trying to compute a lot of this stuff manually is just overwhelming. So if you can pull it from your application, you can immediately go to the areas of concern and start making very small but constructive changes in that way. The other advantage is that you're completing the evaluation loop, so to speak. In other words, you're not just collecting the data, but you're analyzing it and making a change to the curriculum and then recollecting data and reanalyzing. That's the kind of requirement that the accreditors will be demanding. So if you've got a testing committee that has oversight of that particular use of the aggregate test data, you've managed to close your evaluation loop and not left a lot of data unused. The other thing is the testing committee can actually help at the individual student level as well as with aggregate analysis. And when I say at the individual student level, I'm mostly concerned about those students who are academically at risk. They've had problems that have been documented, but there's really no definitive action at this point about their progression in the program. And unfortunately, what may happen is that student slips through the cracks, so to speak, and they end up at the point where they're nearing the end of the curriculum, and that becomes a too little too late type of situation that if you've ever experienced that, it's extremely frustrating and disappointing, both the faculty and the student. All the stakeholders in the educational process are really losing at that point. So the testing committee can make recommendations about individual student interventions. As long as student affairs, again, is in concert with their policy making, with what the testing committee is recommending, this can work rather well. A good example being a longitudinal student data collection tool. Students can monitor their own progression, perhaps. Instructors certainly would be doing this. And as the testing committee finds tools or features in an application that they already have purchased for this purpose, perhaps, then there can really be some policy setting around the need for all faculty to participate, so that if an at-risk student is in their course, the tools have already been identified and they're set up to pull the data that's needed that can be used to help show the student where the problems are and come up with a plan of action. In many cases, schools are now requiring course coordinators to submit their data sets. That information can go back to the testing committee. So it's the student test data, but also what was done to facilitate the students' review and remediation, for instance, over the weak areas, so that this is not a process of reinventing the wheel every time the students come into a course and hit snags with these particular areas or difficulties that they've had with the content. Remediation plans, I certainly support the idea of creating plans in the form of a student learning contract. These can be templates that the testing committee makes available to the faculty for use throughout the curriculum. And they can be a very consistent contract then that the students come to expect. They then don't have interesting and possibly not effective strategies that they're enacting in one course versus another if they've got difficulties learning a content area or remediating over a content area. But you can get a very consistent type of remediation practice that's student will be engaged in across all courses. And finally, if you can summarize this and document this, it's again closing that evaluation loop overall, always in concert with the policies that have been established by whichever body is in charge of admission, progression, and graduation. So the testing committee would really be the overt example of how the program is adhering to best practices. And best practices in clinical practice have been around for quite a while in the use of evidence bases. The same is true in academia, but there's probably not been as much of a concerted effort to document these and to come up with a systematic way of ensuring that all of this happens throughout the entire curriculum and every course is addressed. So the first step in developing a testing committee is to make sure that there is indeed proper representation and that there is proper authority for carrying out the activities that the committee's been charged with doing. representation across all levels of the program can be extremely important, because obviously there's going to be different types of student requirements at the entry point versus the exit point, but there needs to be consistency in the way testing is handled throughout all portions of the program. It's also important, particularly as novice faculty are entering the institution, that the testing committee can in some ways become a clearinghouse of resources for those new faculty. They can also set up even workshop situations, things that can elevate faculty skills with things like test item writing, with things like conducting a systematic item analysis following every one of their tests. This committee, as a subcommittee of the curriculum committee, can be extremely effective, and then again, oversight by the faculty council or some type of overarching faculty committee would be necessary to enact the policies. Enforcement can be an issue. Not all faculty will have the same level of skill, obviously, and frankly, not all faculty may be on board with the decisions that have been made about style guides, exam banks, and how these are to be constructed. So there does need to be a proper level of authority. For instance, if a style guide will be created and there is a faculty member not participating or ignoring these kinds of requirements, there needs to be a way that that person can be brought back in alignment. Otherwise, what may happen that's a real negative consequence is you'll have faculty in one course enforcing the policy, not so in another course, and it puts a student in a situation where they now, again, could be in that mode where they're getting what would be seen as more capricious type of treatment and not handled fairly throughout the program. So here's a overview of the best practices that I would recommend. Best practice number one, in establishing this committee, one of the first things committees can do is publish the guidelines for exam development that will be used throughout the program. This would include a writing style protocol, and I don't know if you've ever had this experience yourself as a test taker, but when you have a test that has a series of questions that are obviously created by different people at different times, some of the questions in a nursing context, for instance, might name the patient by name. Others will call the patient a patient. Others will call the patient a client. The healthcare provider also could be named. Maybe not. Maybe they're a physician. Maybe they're not. This kind of inconsistency is likely not going to create a huge alteration in student response or therefore grades, but it's extremely distracting to the reader to see these inconsistencies throughout the exam. So a writing style protocol that applies across all tests that are used in the curriculum can be very valuable. It will increase the quality of the tests in every course as a result. The other improvement that's necessary is the incorporation of what we call critically thinking test items that, as Jason mentioned, was the subject of a previous webinar that ExamSoft had hosted. And the idea behind the production of these test items is that on the cognitive taxonomy, the questions are being presented at the application and above level, not at the basic knowledge and comprehension level. This will also increase the value of the tests of the students, and it will give you more insight into their ability to not only know the content, but be able to apply it in a real-life situation. The other portion of this testing committee requirement should be that exam administration policies are handled consistently, and the test committee can specify how exam administrations are supposed to be handled within the program, the length of exams, the amount of time allotted. Some of this may have constraint due to availability of computer lab resources, but consistency is important throughout the program in regard to not only where the exam is given and how long the students have to take the exam, but what the proctoring guidelines are going to be. And obviously with proctoring, there's much more accuracy and the ability to assume that you've got very reliable data versus any type of non-proctored situation. But what would be the appropriate guidelines? These are the things that the testing committee should make recommendations about. Also, how the grades are going to be disseminated. How does this fit for your program within the university's broader policy, if there is one, on dissemination of grades? And then lastly, the test review. This can be a bit of a controversy in many programs, and this would be the practice of allowing students to review the exam after they had taken it so that they can review teacher-prepared rationales that describe why the correct answer was correct and why all other answers were incorrect. Should it be done? How should it be done? What will secure the test content? Are there particular restrictions that need to happen with the way the test review is managed in the program? That would be a typical type of recommendation that the testing committee could work out and put together. Their other activities include employing that systematic item analysis and describing for faculties how this item analysis should take place, the statistical parameters that are important, what should be documented, which psychometric standards does the program adhere to, and as I said, there are not only those published by the American Psychological Association, there's also information available through the National League for nursing-specific testing. And there should be a way of including important pieces of documentation for every test that are included as part of the standard test administration procedure. Specifically, not only the statistical analysis that the testing application supplies, the test blueprint that can also be supplied out of the testing software, and then individual items that the faculty have earmarked for further rewriting, perhaps some small editing or perhaps major rewriting, or indeed when an item has been deemed obsolete and needs to be removed from the bank. So there should be procedures for these that the testing committee can decide upon and can publish. Finally, any standardized test results that are generated in the program, these should be analyzed by the testing committee. And again, the curriculum committee should be charged with making decisions and doing approvals as to how those standardized test results are going to be interpreted, and then how the curriculum, for instance, may be changed, or the curriculum evaluation processes may be impacted by the standardized test results. So the testing committee really has oversight over both the teacher-made test policies within the program as well as the way the standardized tests are administered and data is gathered from those. Writing style protocol I mentioned briefly. These are examples of questions that the testing committee can consider. With a smaller group of people in the form of the committee, it's much easier to come to consensus on this type of style guideline information and then seek approval from the overall faculty. The proportion of application above items is really essential. I think this is one of the areas that may be overlooked, frankly, in some testing committee situations, but it's very, very important that not only are the style pieces there, but even more important that the level of question that is acceptable for use and plugged into this item bank for the school meet the criteria of testing students at the higher level of the cognitive taxonomy. There's such a huge need in a practice discipline such as nursing to focus on the actions that the nurse will take and the prioritization that will go into planning and action, that questions need to be written specifically around those particular behaviors. You've got to know through the test that your students not only know their content, but they know how to apply their content in an emerging patient situation. So if the test bank is full of questions that do not reflect those higher level cognitive taxonomy levels, it's important for those corrections to that item bank to be made so that the items that are at the higher level of the taxonomy are incorporated in much greater numbers. And in fact, some testing committees will not only mandate this, but they'll evaluate that as part of their scoring categorization that they establish within the item bank. So the questions are actually locked into a particular cognitive level when the faculty are writing the items and making that determination about the level that the item actually represents, and that information becomes part of the item bank, so that when the test blueprint is constructed, every single item can be revealed as to its level on the cognitive taxonomy. And if the percentage of application above items is not high enough to the level that the testing committee has recommended, further action is indicated before the next test is given. For best practice number 4, obviously one way to get at this is through the use of statistical parameters for item analysis, and these need to be very carefully identified and consistently used. So these are example questions that the faculty serving on the testing committee could determine and could publish, so that other faculty would be using the same types of statistical indicators to analyze every time they gave a test. This 3-step methodology is fairly common. I've talked about this a lot and used it very successfully. When you establish what the KR-20, your index of reliability that you're using for the exam, is indeed meeting your standards, there's further information that you need to probe for. Because remember, you could have a solid KR-20 on a test that's still comprised of primarily knowledge comprehension questions, and that's not going to solve your problem later on when you're really looking toward achievement of your full program outcomes. You know, did your test instrument really help you determine that your students could think critically? Are they answering those questions at the application above level? You may have a reliable instrument, but it may be testing students on knowledge comprehension level only, which is not going to get the job done. So this information needs to be used frequently. And as Jason mentioned, I'm going to talk about this in more detail in an upcoming webinar next week to really dive into how you can make these statistics work for you. Not only will they give you that consistency and a good documentation of the effectiveness of your item bank and the effectiveness of your program in the sense that your test blueprints would be part of this, but you'll also have some assistance with improving your test items so that you don't feel that you have to rewrite the entire test because you've seen problems with particular items. Instead, you'll be able to pinpoint where your editing needs to happen to get the most results from that effort. These are the typical item analysis standards. So this would be an example that the testing committee should consider each of these parameters. If these are going to be tracked on each of the tests that are delivered throughout the program, then these standards of acceptance need to be applied as well for each of those particular parameters. And there is indeed, again, documentation that can be made at the point that every test is given, and the aggregate of all of these can be up for review by the testing committee on a recurring basis. And at that point in time, literally over several academic years, the program is well prepared for their next accreditation visit in terms of how effective their analysis of the curriculum using their testing data has been, because the information's being accrued not in one huge, massive, panic-driven style effort as accreditation draws near, but very systematically as each course is delivered throughout the entire program, year in and year out. These are the standards of acceptance for nursing. I just want to make one mention that because the nursing student population, by the time they meet that upper division of the major, and the courses literally are the same type of clinical experience, in many cases sections taught by the same faculty, there's not as much variance in student performance at those levels. So the standards, obviously with less variance in the student scores, there will be an impact on the discrimination level as well as on the KR-20, the index of reliability that's used. And there needs to be a little bit of alteration, I would say, in terms of the standards that testing committees should achieve, or at least encourage their faculties to strive for. KR-20s above 0.65, that's great. If you have them in the 0.70, then the typical standard, that's fantastic. But you shouldn't put yourself on notice as not being effective if you're not able to achieve that high level with your KR-20s across all courses, particularly at those upper levels where there's less variance in your student scores. One of the areas that can really be important for the testing committee to scrutinize and to remind faculty to look at, every time they receive their item analysis data, they should be looking at the student response frequencies. And these 0 items, the ones where nobody is choosing the option, really are red flags for being rewritten. These options are not plausible. In many cases, even your student who doesn't know much of the content at all is able to glean enough from simply a review of the question or from the weakness of that particular option that distractor is not plausible to them. So there's more guesswork that happens, and the more guessing that goes on, obviously you're not really getting at your test taker's true score, their true ability and performance. So do yourself a favor. You can use that response frequency information from your testing software to help you identify which questions need to be treated, and particularly which distractors are not working. If you have a small group of students, a lot of times what you can do is look cumulatively at that data and see if you've had that same problem with response frequencies where you've got a lot of 0 distractors. They're not being chosen by anyone. And that might help if you've got a small number of students taking the test at one time. But it's important to go in and edit those, and you'll get almost immediate results. If you've really done a good job of re-editing those items, you've plugged in plausible distractors, the next time around when you actually use that item with students, you're likely to see an improvement in the discrimination value immediately. The testing committee can adopt some type of master test blueprint. If you're in a paper and pencil world, there's still a way to create a faculty-generated test blueprint. It's a lot of work. I'm being honest with you. It's a lot of manual work, but it certainly needs to be documented in some way so that you can establish the validity of the test within the course by linking the actual test content and objectives to the test items that were used. Obviously, a superior way is to use the electronic blueprint. From my experience, a master blueprint that's been adopted where very specific scoring categories are tracked. They're used across every test, and they're linked within every test item. And that's the beauty of the software in eliminating tons of manual effort. So in this case, I've got nursing process as a scoring category, and I have client needs. So what the testing committee might say is that every exam needs to include, say, 10% of that total exam on the concept of assessment. In this case, this exam only has 9.09% of content that's linked to assessment. So it would give the faculty an immediate nudge. I need to add another question that's been categorized as an assessment question to this test so I can meet the stated standard for the program. And then again, at the point where accreditation is looming, perhaps, it will be very easy to answer a question such as, how do you establish that assessment is taught as well as evaluated throughout your program? Well, we can use the tests as one example, that 10% of every test will reference assessment as a concept that's being tested, regardless of what the course content is. Same thing can happen with client needs. You can use the client needs that are established by the National Council of State Boards of Nursing that are relevant to the licensure exam. In other disciplines, the same kind of process can be used to link any of your major certification categories of record to what you're doing in your teacher-made tests if you are indeed preparing students for some type of licensure or certification at the end of the program. And you can track the percentage of those items that are incorporated into the teacher-made tests truly as you get the students in their last semester leading up to the point where they'll actually be sitting for these types of exams. You can emulate the same type of percentages that they're going to see on their licensure exam on your own teacher-made comprehensive test. After a test has been given, there's some type of information that should be gathered together. And this was the example I made earlier of the testing committee should be able to have some type of requirement where they request of every course coordinator a summary of that faculty member's review of their test. And it would contain supporting documentation that, again, as I said, makes the test very defensible from the point of view that it was indeed valid because it tested the objectives and in the proper weighting and array of those objectives within the course as they're presented. And it's also demonstrating statistically that a reliable exam was actually given to the students. So these types of documents can be gathered together and held as a summary of test review. And over time, this becomes a very valuable longitudinal record of consistency in test production used in the program year in and year out across courses. And it can be very useful, particularly, as we mentioned earlier, with curriculum review, so curriculum evaluation, but also when you have new faculty coming in to teach a course for the first time, it can be very, very helpful information to them. So I would say, in summary, the best practices that you're really looking for and what you want your testing committee to help faculty establish are things like consistency in providing test blueprints. There should be a test blueprint for every test that's given in the program. There also should be some style guidelines that are published that all faculty have very accessible to faculty so that they can use those while they're actually developing new test items. There should be a mandate to incorporate test questions at the higher level of the Bloom's taxonomy or the cognitive taxonomy, less involvement with those knowledge comprehension items. And in some cases, this is a gradual process. Many item banks, it may come as a surprise and even a shock when the testing committee looks across the item banks that have been compiled from programs with courses where they've simply had independent faculty working in each of those courses and not collaboratively in a centralized test banking scheme, that there are quite a few of those item banks that may be made up of mostly knowledge and comprehension items. And it will take several semesters, sometimes even years of item writing to change that proportion so that more of the items are reflecting the application and above cognitive level. Indeed, a systematic item analysis of some type should be adopted. The testing committee should also have a mechanism to teach faculty how to do this and to require that this is done after each test is given. Some of the things that can happen that can also be very beneficial to the quality of tests in your program are allowing the testing committee to make recommendations about the types of items that are used, because nursing students have to be prepared to handle the alternative item formats. So this would be items that deviate from the standard single answer, 4-choice, multiple choice question. Things such as fill in the blank items or the so-called hotspot item where an area of a graphic has to be clicked by the student to answer the question correctly. Things like the select all that apply where there may be more than one answer that's required in order for the question to be graded as being correct. So those alternative item formats should be incorporated across all tests. But I think it's important for faculty to recognize and for the testing committee to also affirm that exposure to alternative item formats should not only happen on the teacher-made test. That's not the only area of the curriculum where students can get experience with these. There's ways to incorporate those as homework, into homework assignments, into practice quizzes, into group work in class. And that's really the key, is to show that those alternative item formats are getting some widespread practice in every course that students have access to. But as a rule of thumb, the testing committee could include a policy such as this one where at least 10% of alternative item formats will show up on any given test so that students are not completely left to finally figure out what's going on with types other than single answer multiple choice in their last semester of the program. That would not be good. Remove items also that no longer align to national standards, that have become obsolete, and they no longer reflect current clinical practice. This is something that needs to also have some systematic review and enforcement. And for example, the National Council they've made changes in the NCLEX when nursing diagnosis categorization, for instance, is no longer used on the NCLEX. If you've got items that still are reflective of that, there may be some of these items that are now obsolete, or they now need to be rewritten into a format that's more reflective of the licensure exam. Another example from the licensure exam for medications, there are no longer the 100% of the time an inclusion of trade names and generic names or generic names. In this case, the licensure exam will be reflecting primarily generic names for medications. Many faculty test banks have not been updated to reflect that same type of style that's been used in creating the test items. So the testing committee should stay abreast of these types of things and should be the oversight to be sure that the item bank that's in use in the program is indeed adhering to the national standards and having obsolete items removed on a consistent basis. For competencies, similar to that alternative item format explanation that I gave, there should indeed be oversight by the testing committee to be sure that the what I'd consider the non-negotiable, the absolutely essential, the absolute mastery component, these are typically safety items, and again, medication-related items are presented in every course, on every test. So a good example might be 10% of all test items need to be medication calculation items, regardless of test, regardless of course. Those are the kinds of things that the testing committee can give oversight to that would be across the entire curriculum. And then again, just areas where consistency can really be your key. It's your evidence basis for these academic related decisions that you're making. So test length, for example, some programs have chosen to identify not test length simply based on the time they have available in a computer lab that's fairly arbitrary, but instead to consistently identify, well, what is the test length that best leads to student success? What are the students going to have to do on the licensure exam? They don't need to necessarily create a test that has a maximum of 6 hours available to students, but they should be creating tests that require students to move at a pace through the exam that would be consistent with the kind of pace that they're going to have at the point that they're sitting for the licensure exam. And the testing committee might even recommend maybe there's more time per item that's identified for the first level of the program, but by the second level of the program, the students should be showing greater proficiency, and they should be able to move through test items at a quicker pace. Those are all decisions that the testing committee can weigh in on. Other best practices include scoring benchmarks being adopted. Sometimes if it's a standardized test, there will be evidence that the standardized test provider should supply about those scoring benchmarks and why those were recommended and what kind of research was done to help establish those. Faculty can do the same thing with the types of scoring benchmarks based on their policies for admission, progression, and such through the program. And that information is very, very helpful and actually should not only generate within the testing committee, this will then carry over, as I said, in synergy with the Student Affairs Committee and may become obviously part of student handbook material and syllabus material that the students will receive, so that there's very clear communication about these. The consistent weight that exams will carry in the course grade, both the teacher-made tests and the standardized exams, should be something that the testing committee weighs in on. They need to clearly look at new evidence that comes out, new research results, and national trends on that. And then consequences for failure. The example I gave earlier, particularly for students that are at risk, there needs to be specific student learning contracts or other types of remediation activities specified that students need to complete so that the areas of weakness that they've shown based on the teacher-made test scoring reports and on their standardized test scoring reports can be tracked. And this is a confidence-building activity for students. I think one of the areas that I have that's of concern, particularly if it's not carried out in a student-centered way and student affairs isn't actively involved, is that it can be perceived by the students as a punitive activity. Nothing can be further from the truth. This is an example of enforcing good study habits, teaching test-taking strategies, really focusing in on the student, perhaps in one-to-one conversation with the student and the faculty member to identify where the student's weaknesses are and do something about those. This is in a much more proactive approach throughout the curriculum instead of waiting until the end of the curriculum to try to correct numerous deficiencies and deficits. So this should be a student-centered activity, but the testing committee can indeed make some very important recommendations about handling those remediation activities. And then I would always say there's a very important role that the testing committee needs to have related to the publishing of good proctoring guidelines, the kinds of test security measures that are used in the program. This is the thing, again, that ensures that the data that will be analyzed is indeed data that can be trustworthy. So I would encourage faculties to look very carefully at test security information. There's a lot of new information. There's some new research coming out, and you can read about some of that, particularly in nursing. Some of the nursing education journals and conferences have specifically addressed this. A lot of this is due to the concern that the inconsistencies applied in proctoring are actually detrimental. They're leading to more lapses in test security, but with more consistencies and a clearer understanding of the expectations of both the proctor and the student, there will be less opportunity for test security to break down. And certainly with the data forensic information that's supplied through a software application, there's some very, very good key tools that faculty can use to examine the quality of the data that they're getting from their tests. So I guess in summary, I would say a testing committee can add a lot of value to the nursing program or any program in higher education by focusing on emphasizing for faculty where the standards are, how those standards recommendations can be used across the curriculum in synergy with what's going on with student affairs, setting policy, or the overall faculty council. Certainly can improve the use of data to make very sound decisions, not only about the individual student avoiding the too little too late situation, but indeed for the entire curriculum. You've got a real wonderful tool for curriculum evaluation at your fingertips if the data can be organized and can be routinely analyzed in a way that leads the faculty to a very robust level of assessment. And believe me, when it's time for reaffirmation of accreditation to roll around, the value of that testing committee will be immediately known as all of that data collection has occurred throughout multiple semesters and multiple years. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'll turn this back over to Jason.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nibert. I do apologize. I lost audio there for a moment. Are you able to still hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. We do have a few questions from the audience today, and I would like to share those. This question is, can you share the names of some of the software used to assess and aggregate test data?
Yeah, definitely. The applications that ExamSoft supplies would really cover virtually all of these areas that I've addressed today. So there are blueprinting functionalities, there are item bank categorization functionalities, and obviously all of the item analysis statistics that were included in this discussion, being able to track the KR-20s, the point by serial correlation coefficients, difficulty levels, or other discrimination indexes are all available through the ExamSoft application and can be very, very useful, again, in cutting down faculty workload so that they're not addressing these kinds of things manually, but instead can simply use the applications to provide the data and organize it, and then they can actually spend their time more productively analyzing it, setting the benchmarks, and making those policy recommendations.
Excellent, thank you. The next question is, what percentage of each exam should be application versus knowledge and comprehension? Yeah,
there's definitely, differences of opinion about that, indeed I would hazard to say, without knowing specifics about any particular research articles, there's likely, different evidence maybe that's been identified on that. I would say a general rule of thumb, though, is that if the way your curriculum objectives overall have been prepared, they're in a obviously student-centered set of objectives, and they all reference the ability to apply the knowledge, then there's likely very little need to spend time on your teacher-made tests. As remember, testing is taking time away from class, it's taking time away from clinical, in a sense, where you can also work on these skills. But if that's the case, you need to make that test work for you for the amount of time that you're taking away from these other activities to do it. So I would hazard to say that if you've loaded 50% of your test with knowledge comprehension questions, you're not really getting the most bang for your buck for the amount of time that you're spending. 50% of the data that you will collect will simply show you that your students may have capabilities in terms of memorizing, but that's not the full story. That's not what they need in order to be an effective nurse and to practice safely in the clinical area. So that's why I think the trend now is to push for much more application level questions on the actual testing instrument that you use. If you need students to learn facts, to have content that they can then apply on your test, there are ways to do that with, as I mentioned, homework assignments and flashcards and computer applications that are skill drill types of things. But on the test, you need to see how they can apply that. So, I would say clearly the predominance, without giving maybe a specific percentage, but the predominance of questions should be at the application and above level.
Excellent, thank you. And the next question is, can you recommend some sort of primer or resource to help me understand the application of this type of statistical data?
Yeah, that, as I mentioned, that we have an upcoming webinar. In fact, let me see. I'm going to go ahead and put that slide up, Jason. I think I have. Here's the information about the upcoming webinar. We're going to be talking in that one specifically about conducting the item analysis using that three-step method and things that you would look for as you're analyzing the KR-20, the difficulty, the discrimination, and those response frequencies for improving your test. There are lots of great resources out there, but again, I would start right here with the ExamSoft collection. There's several webinars that have addressed these kinds of things that have been presented in the past that are I believe, stored as recorded webinars that you could access.
Excellent. And one final question is, how do you address the inconsistency of faculty buy-in in the enforcement of policy? Wouldn't that impose upon academic freedom?
Well, you know, that's an argument to be made. I think what's really happening is that you're not telling faculty, so to speak, you know, how they should present topics. You're tapping on their expertise. What you're doing is simply laying the framework for creating the most effective test that they can create. One of the areas that I would encourage in the formulation of a testing committee is that if you do have a faculty member that is very committed to that concept of academic freedom within that program, that is the individual that you indeed want on the testing committee, so that there can be you know, both sides of that argument presented every time there is a particular recommendation on the table for discussion. But I believe that the framework is really not designed to inhibit academic freedom, of course, but instead to provide students with a more consistent experience when it comes to something as important as a grade determining activity like their unit exam that they're going to be taking in each of their courses. Excellent.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nibert, for sharing your time and expertise with us today. We do appreciate you taking part of your afternoon to present this excellent information.
It's my pleasure.
I would like to remind everyone that today, at the conclusion of the webinar, you will have an opportunity to participate in the 7-question survey. The completion of this survey helps us provide relevant content in all future presentations. Please do register and attend our upcoming webinar entitled Grading Your Assessments, How to Evaluate the Quality of Your Exams, also presented by Dr. Ainslie Nibert. This presentation is scheduled for March 12th at 2 o'clock Eastern. Please visit learn.examsoft.com/resources for more information. This concludes today's presentation. Thank you so much, everyone, for your attendance. For more information, please feel free to call, email, or visit our website. Have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.